Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Rowing Chat. My name is Rebecca Caro, and I want to start by asking you if you can help me out. Rowing Chat wants to know about you, the loyal listener. Can you help us by taking a very short survey? The website address is bit.ly/Rowing Chat surveys. That's bit.ly/Rowing Chat survey. The more we know, the better we can make Rowing Chat for you. Now, this week, Rowing Chat is sponsored by my book, Rowing Tales. Go and get a copy for yourself. It's on Amazon. It's on the Row Perfect website. It's a pretty good book. I would say that, wouldn't I? And you can also get it online. Lots of short stories on rowing themes, from disaster at Henley to novice success, from capsized swimming to seeing the perfect sunrise. One of the stories was about Thames tradesmen who were winners of the Grand at Henley, and all their supporters rushed to greet the crew after their final, and they got a right royal soaking. To find out how that happened, read the book. People ask me how I get my rowing tales, and the answer is I get them from people like you. I'm collecting tales now for the 2018 book. Have you got a rowing story to tell? Something curious or wryly funny, disastrous, friendships, enmities, wildlife or scenery? Email me with your story idea to Becky, BECKY @rowperfect.co.uk, and I'll explain more. And also send me any ideas you might have from your friends. I'm also looking for an artist to design the cover artwork. So if you know someone who is an artist and understands rowing, I'd very much like to hear from you. Now, let's move to greeting our Rowing Chat guests today. Today we have Hugh Matheson and Chris Dodd with us. Welcome, guys.
Nice to be here.
Now, could you introduce yourselves to the listeners and tell them a little bit about yourself and your background in rowing? Chris, would you like to go first?
Yes, well, I rowed at school and gave up when I was a student, and had nothing more to do with the sport as I became a journalist. And then I started writing about rowing in 1970. And since then, I've written several history books about the sport and got involved with setting up the River and Rowing Museum in Henley-on-Thames.
You.
I started for the best possible reason, which was that I was hopeless at cricket, and therefore, as a 13-year-old, took this up. And I had a very good reason for being motivated, which was that I grew extraordinarily tall for those days, normal now, but 6'6", age 15 in 1964 was astonishing. And I felt completely awkward, couldn't talk to girls, and generally found life impossible, except when I was in a boat. And the only time that people did not accuse me of being lazy was when I was pulling on an oar. So I pulled harder and harder. And years and years later, find myself racing crews coached by Jurgen Grobler, who we're going to talk about later on in the program, and indeed racing those people to a standstill sometimes. And they became the benchmark. So years later, when I'd become a sports writer rather than a journalist, I can't call myself a proper journalist. I just wrote about rowing and the odd car review and so on. And years later, I really, really wanted to explain about his life, and more than that, actually to explain about the whole East German rowing phenomenon, which lasted for 20 years.
Fantastic. And the two of you have written a book. Hugh, do you want to wave it at the screen?
I'll hold it very still so that you can read every detail of the title, but it's called More Power, which is denied in the book by one of Jurgen's coxes, but I heard him saying while coaching a crew, rather than telling them to get the outside shoulder a bit higher or the inside hand a bit lower, he said, more power. And it became iconic. And a lot of people actually believe that that is his key message, is to pull harder And most rowing people will recognize that as the only important factor in the sport. It's published by Harlequin, HQ. Harlequin otherwise is known for Bodice Rippers, Mills and Boon, but this is the first of their sports books.
Well, the Bodice Rippers are very attractive, and a rowing Bodice Ripper, there's a novel that no one's written yet. So, Chris, what attracted you to writing this book when Jurgen didn't want to collaborate on it?
Well, when Jurgen first moved to Britain, I was the editor of Regatta magazine, which was published by the Amateur Rowing Association, as it was then called, now British Rowing. And so every year I used to meet up with Jurgen in December to get his lie on what was going to happen that year and to build towards the next Olympics. And every time we met, and we used to have a good session, he was very cooperative with the magazine all through those years. I asked him, what about doing a biography, Jurgen, or an autobiography? And he always said, no, I wait till I retire. And a couple of years ago, I met him for, again, this regular meeting in December, and asked him again, and he said the same answer. And I said, well, you're not going to retire, so why don't we do something, or you do something now? And at this point, Hugh came along and found us an agent and found us a publisher, and we started out on the book with Jurgen's sort of tacit approval at that point.
And then what happened? You got writing,
well,
presumably?
Jurgen agreed to cooperate with us. And we said, give us a few hours of your time to answer our questions, and then we'll let you concentrate on coaching your crews for the rest of the time, the rest of the year. And he turned up to our meeting, which was all arranged at Leander Club, the club that he first worked for when he moved from East Germany. And he came in the room and said, I've decided not to do it. So then we never switched the tape on, and the three of us went down to the bar, and we spent an hour and a half listening to stories that Jurgen told us. And we've remained on good terms ever since then. But it is, a fact that the book does not have the word official biography on the cover.
It doesn't. Now, you've structured the book quite interestingly into 4-year Olympic cycles, running through broadly what Jurgen was doing, who he was coaching, who his star athletes were, and the principal results from the period. Obviously, getting closer to the recent day, you've had access to the athletes and able to insert a lot more quotes and direct insight from the people who've been under his direction. Overall, though, from your researches, what is the one defining quality that you think Jurgen Grobler has as a rowing coach?
Thoroughness, focus and thoroughness.
Tell me more.
Can I pop in at this point to say that from the very beginning, when we first understood that East German rowing was different, that is to say, when they first started winning all the races, a British coach called Bruce Granger got hold of a copy of Das Rudern, which was the book written for all novice rowers to read and to follow right the way through. And if you followed it from page 1 to page 88 or whatever it was, you would go from being a novice to being almost an international standard oarsman, at least a Cadre 1 oarsman, which is the category from which their national crews were trained. And Granger got hold of this book, and the physics of the way a boat moves, the biomechanics of the way the body moves, the psychology of the way that a rower can accept instruction, can improve their attitude to training and improve their capacity for winning. All of this was set out But when we both of us, Chris and I, both spoke to Granger at that time, this is in the early 80s or possibly even the late 70s, I can't remember. And he'd done this translation, and he said what it comes down to is doing simple things really well. It's not rocket science, it's not complicated. Well, actually, it was quite rocket sciencey. It involved a lot of medicine that was novel. It involved naval architecture and the design of the boats, which was novel. It involved a lot of science that was actually taken back to first principles and then built up. But it is the application. It is an applied science, rowing, as applied by Jurgen through 50 years of outstanding success. So when Chris says thoroughness, that's it. All he does is take the Das Ruder, the Bible of rowing, and turn it into success on the water by applying every one of its tenets with the maximum guile, as well as Chris put it, focus.
So a lot of stuff that you read about in the book is the sort of thing that a club coach could definitely take on board and execute, even without the resources of a national federation behind them.
I think absolutely they can. And funnily enough, it didn't enter the country when Jurgen came to Great Britain in 1991. It actually entered the country 20 years before, in 1969, when Bob Janousek came from a similarly scientific background at Charles V University in Prague. And Bob Janousek arrived, he took over the national squad. It was shambolically organized at the time. That was nobody's fault. It was just the way things were. There was no national program. Bob came in and he made great strides. And indeed, the crews that he coached, which I was lucky enough to be in, were beginning to win medals on an annual basis. But his greatest contribution, in my opinion, to British rowing was not just getting us up to medal level on the podium, but was actually the coaching award scheme that he designed and implemented and taught and judged for people to get their different level of awards. And that is what transformed British rowing right down through the club system. Because from, and I can't remember the date, but sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, every single coach who wanted to be taken seriously would have done the coaching award schemes run by the then Amateur Rowing Association, as it was, and would have taken that stuff back to their clubs. There were still some pretty bad coaches, but in the middle of it all, there were some seriously talented people who took what Bob said and made British rowing go from, I think we were 14th ranked in world rowing in 1972, and took us right up to the top.
That's fascinating. And so what I believe you're telling us is the professionalization of rowing coaching in Britain started a long time before the current system as we see it today, but its foundational roots are in doing the basics really, really well.
Got to take the word professional out of what you just said there, because they were all amateur, both the coaches and the rowers. So Janousek came from a system where people were paid to row, as did Jurgen come from a system where East Germans were paid right the way through their lives as Cadre 1 athletes. They were looked after. They lived in boathouses that were very well equipped, comfortable places to live. They were beautifully fed. They had very good doctors. They had the whole setup, as well as a living wage. And their parents and other family members got better jobs as well. The whole system was highly structured around that success. Meanwhile, in Great Britain and in New Zealand and in the rest of the Western world, there were very, very little pockets of properly funded athletes, but by and large, it was all done on the goodwill of clubs and the amateur approach. So it didn't get professional till 1997, when the Sports Lottery Fund in Britain started shoveling money at it. And about the same time, New Zealand also started pushing money at it. And Australia had started just a few years before, when they won the right to put on the Sydney 2000 Olympics. And so they founded the Institute, the AIS, the Australian Institute of Sport, and started shoveling money into rowing, among other Olympic sports. But prior to that, there was no professional about it. What we did have was really well-trained, deeply embedded science in the two great coaches that have functioned in Britain, Janousek and Grobler. Janousek went off to build boats and do other things and had nothing like the record that Grobler had. And the title of best Olympic coach ever definitely goes to Grobler, but Janousek's influence was important at the beginning.
So shifting from East Germany to the UK system must have been incredibly difficult for Jurgen. Why do you principally think that was the case?
Well, Chris was watching more closely at that time than I was, so he should tell you.
I mean, one thing we should remember is that the DDR, the East German rowing, was state-sponsored, and if they didn't carry on winning the medals, particularly gold medals, the funding would have disappeared. And we are now living in a system in Britain which is very similar to that. I think Jurgen was fortunate in that he took the job, first of all, at Leander, starting in 1991, where he inherited the world's two best athletes at the time, Steve Redgrave and Matthew Pinsent. So he came from a system where he had the pick of the best athletes to a system where he had the two best. It was a kind of, I mean, Britain was stuck with a very small squad of top-level athletes at the time, but they gradually built up as Jurgen moved to become national coach for men after the Barcelona Olympics. And then, of course, in 1996, Redgrave and Pinsent's gold medal in Atlanta was the only medal that Team GB won in those Olympics, which sent a shockwave through the nation.
So that was the only gold medal.
That led to the funding of from the National Lottery.
What was Leander Club like, Chris, in 1991? It obviously was a very successful rowing club, but in terms of its facilities, because Jurgen joined it as head coach?
Yes, he did. I mean, at that time, the Amateur Rowing Association was in chaos and didn't have much funds, and they kept, it seemed every once a month they changed the performance director and the senior national coaches and so on. Leander had made a big effort as a club to start a cadet scheme to pick out likely rowers and turn them into Henley winners. And they were very keen to, having inherited Steve Redgrave from Marlow Rowing Club and his former coach, Mike Spracklin, who by this time had gone to Canada to coach. They were very anxious to hire a top-level guy and to, I suppose, lead British rowing.
But the contrast with what you described earlier, Hugh, is the complete professionalization of the East German system at the time was enormous. Leander Club was still essentially an amateur rowing club with a nice boathouse on a nice stretch of water. Is that correct?
It is. I think that the important thing, the difference between the way Janousek took over the whole squad straight away and had to try and build a squad system, and Jurgen didn't try that. Jurgen came in and he took the two best athletes in the world, as described by Chris, and he made certain in year one that they won in 1991 in Vienna in the pair. And that meant turning them around and putting Pinsent had stroke. It were a whole lot of things. Some of that was good science. Some of that involved incorporating other East Germans. Klaus Filter came and redesigned their boat. He spent months living with the Ailing family and built a boat for Pinsent and Redgrave. They had everything devoted, all the effort of all these people was poured into that single pair. Jurgen was well aware that if the pair didn't look like it was going to win, he'd have to put together a four or something else. So he was training other people. But I think on a sort of, I have no idea because he hasn't told us, but I bet you that he was pretty relieved when during the trials and during the earlier regattas, I think it was pre-World Cup in 1991, or maybe there was a World Cup, I can't remember. But in the early regattas, they started showing their pace and their ability to win. And he realized he wouldn't have to, with great relief, put together a bigger crew. And that was what he then took through to the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona. In the meantime, lots of other people in British rowing were doing what they'd always done. So Molesey Boat Club and others were training squads and going through the process. There was I must put in this plug, as you perfectly well both will expect me to do, that Notts County Rowing Association in Nottingham was doing its stuff. And in fact, the chief selector came from Nottingham, that's Mark Lees in 1992. And he had the lucky, happy task of having the world champions Redgrave and Pinsent in a coxless pair trial beaten by another pair called the Searle brothers. And it turned out that there were background reasons why that happened, but it basically came down to the fact that the Searles had set that as their target and gone about it in an incredibly thorough and thoughtful way. And so entirely separate from Jurgen, they beat the reigning world champions and gave the selectors, or selector, Mark Lees, a huge headache in what to do next. And Jurgen's adaptation to Britain, the blade was tempered in the heat of the 1992 Olympic selection. He looked after his men. He made sure they got a second chance. And I don't think he steered. Mark was a very strong character and knew what he wanted, but it was Mark's decision, turned out to be the right decision for Jurgen, which was he took the winners of the coxless pair trials, the Searle brothers, put them into a coxed pair, which they duly won, and he left Pinsent and Redgrave in the coxless pair, which they won, not at a canter, but very, very decisively. And Jurgen's reputation was made for many people in Britain by his extraordinarily thoughtful and gracious conduct throughout that whole thing. He never got stroppy about it. He just steered it in the way that he hoped it would go and wanted it to go. And lo and behold, we got 2 gold medals in Barcelona.
Now, tell me a little bit more now that obviously Jurgen is in charge of a squad of athletes, heavyweight men. How does he build this squad over the 4 years of an Olympic cycle?
I'll start this. Chris may want to come in on this, but what he doesn't have, curiously, is a published succession strategy. What he does instead is organize trials to which anybody is welcome. Even the people who are rowing for Oxford and Cambridge in the boat race, who are often training not often, always training at a very high level, but training on a completely different cycle to peak at the end of April, not in July or August. And all those people are invited. And then the ambition to get into one of his frontline crews, his medal, his podium crews, is so ferociously hard in every single person in those squads that either they make it by training themselves flat out and following his program, which is brilliantly successful, or they find their own way to the exit. If they're not going to make it, they just drop out. He very rarely, he does drop people, absolutely, who are still striving, but it happens much less often than you think because people know that they're not going to make it. So what you're left with is the cream of the crop, training like buggery and getting themselves by daily, hourly racing into a state where they can withstand almost any pressure that comes in an international regatta. And a perfect illustration of that is that he was running a 4 in the years leading to 2016, but he was also running the 8. And he had people in and out of the 8 and the 4 while he was just quietly selecting. But they would run the German 8, Unified Germany 8, in 2013, 14, and 15. And the British 8 had something, I can't remember what it was, but it was something ridiculously small, something like 3 meters difference between them over the entire 3 years of World Championships. And in Aigues Bellette, the Brits beat the Germans in the 8s by 0.18 of a second. And I remarked to the 2-man of that crew, who asked me when he was waiting in the queue to go and get his medal, he said, how much, what was the difference? What was the margin? And I said 0.18 of a second. And Constantine Laludis said, really, that much? So that is how tight they expect life to be. And they grow up in this world where, as Gregory says in the book, you know you won't stop in an Olympic final after you've been training with Jurgen.
Chris.
That's what Chris got, so he should probably talk to that.
I would just add to that the development of the whole system has underpinned what Jurgen has been able to do when Sir David Tanner has expanded support for the under-23 group, for juniors, got funding for all those kind of things, developed a state-of-the-art training centre at Caversham, invested in physios and boats and equipment and specialist services. You know, what he's actually done is created an East German system to support the chief coaches, both Jurgen and Paul Thompson, the women's coach.
Can I just comment quickly, Rebecca, on that single point about an East German system? East Germany decided that they wanted to do well in sport from the moment that it was allowed to represent itself rather than a unified Germany, which was 1967. And then in the 68 Olympics, that was their first Olympics as 2 separate Germanys. And they decided that this was an opportunity for a buffer state, 16, 17 million people, sandwiched between Poland and the Warsaw Pact and West Germany and the rest of the West. West Germany at that stage full of American troops and British troops and so on. And they thought, how can we survive in this buffer state position? But we will make ourselves known, and sport will be our foreign policy. What we will do, we've got no clout on the world stage. We're never going to be one of the G7 or the G20. What we will do is we'll make it in sport. And they analysed the Olympic sports, and they rejected the ones that they would not be able to do well in. So they rejected modern pentathlon, because the first sport is riding a horse drawn from a pool of other horses at random. So you have no control over which horse you'll be on, and therefore you can't be sure even that your most talented athletes are going to win a gold medal. So they didn't do modern pentathlon. They knew that the Americans would run a better basketball league nationally than they would ever manage in Germany. So they didn't bother with basketball. Curiously, Liz McNichol, when she got UK sport and the sports lottery money flowing into Olympic sport, she went through precisely the same process. And only those sports where we were going, Great Britain was likely to win medals, only those sports with podium potential got the money. And the sports that hadn't got the organization, hadn't got the record of winning in the past, didn't get any money. So and funnily enough, she ended up with exactly the same list of sports It was a completely fascinating parallel, and I hope that they were aware of it at the time, that they were copying these German modus operandi down to the last letter. They probably weren't, but Jurgen will have recognized the process and knew what he had to do. And as Chris said, they had the only medal, gold medal from 1996. So for David Tanner then to make the case for serious funding for rowing was a lot easier on the back of the Redgrave-Pinsent pair.
That's absolutely fascinating, and how ahead of their time in many ways the East German system was. We're going to take a short break to hear from one of our sponsors. You've heard of intelligence quotient, IQ, and probably EQ as well, emotional quotient, but doesn't it strike you as odd that there isn't a score given to the health of your body? We row, many of us take care of our aging bodies, and although masters athletes love to compare our injuries and our recovery strategies, we know that we're both fitter and healthier than much of the population. So why shouldn't we get financial benefits from our rowing practice, from our fit and healthy bodies? Luckily, Health IQ feels the same way. They're a health insurance company who understand health-conscious people are a lower risk category, and they offer lower rates for fit and healthy people, like rowers. If you qualify, you could save a lot of money on your life insurance. Get a free quote today at healthiq.com/rowing, or mention the promotion code rowing when you talk to a Health IQ agent. Go reap even more benefits from your rowing, and you will also be supporting this Rowing Chat podcast. Thanks very much. Now, Chris, what do you think the other British international rowing coaches have benefited in learning from Jurgen Grobler?
Well, I think they've learned really from the system that Bob Janousek put into place when he revolutionized the teaching of rowing in this country. After all, the DDR had done that, as Hugh was saying, with Bruce Granger's translation of their manual. And it's also true that what was going on at the same time was the FISA, the International Rowing Federation's development program, which started with Tor Nielsen, the Norwegian coach, writing coaching manuals for FISA, which are still in use today and are revised every now and then. So I don't know whether Jurgen in particular brought something to other British coaches, but his record is inspiring, as indeed is Paul Thompson. We mustn't forget our women's record, but all of these are essential to keep the money coming in the tighter times we have ahead, which we expect,
which probably are coming right now. Now, you both have an encyclopedic knowledge about the UK rowing scene. Hugh, can you tell us what you now think about losing a possible Olympic gold medal in 1976 when you were in the 8 to a doping East German crew who took the gold?
Writing this book made me do deeper research than I already had into the assistance, I think it was called, that these German athletes had over what we had. And it is a murky picture, which is to say, what they were not doing was taking performance-enhancing drugs that affected them on the day. What they were doing was building up an enormous training backlog of exercise having been taken. And on a supercompensation cycle, they got tireder and tireder as they worked harder and harder. And then they would take the foot off the pedal, they would relax a bit, and their performance would improve to above the level that it had been when they started. And so when they're on the down slope of a supercompensation cycle, they felt they needed something to help them recover more quickly. And so they took oral turinabol and they were given it. It was extremely ruthlessly applied. You had no choice but to take the blue pill on your breakfast tray. You had to take it in the dining room. You had to eat it in the dining room, and the coaches watched you eat it. You couldn't say, I'll take it back to my room and have it later. You absolutely had to do it. So the athletes were not particularly aware of what was in the blue pill, but they did have the capacity to endure the training that they were doing, made a great deal easier by it. And Jana Sorgas, who we quote in the book and who interviewed extremely helpfully for it, said that when she was training with the DDR crews, German Democratic Republic, East German crews, up to and including her Olympic gold medal in 1988, she was clearly within the system and taking the blue pills. She then stopped rowing for a couple of years when the wall fell and East Germany fell apart and was absorbed into the Federal Republic. But she took it up again and she got her mojo working. And in 1996, she was in a unified Germany quad, which won a second Olympic gold medal. And if you ask her about that, she just says the second one was a bloody sight harder than the first one. There was no help with recovery. So the 8 that we raced in 76 was behind all the way through the first 1,000. We took the lead at 1,000. We stretched the lead out to almost a length at one point. And then when we it was a headwind over 2,000 meters in old-fashioned equipment. A good time in those days for the full track would be somewhere around 5:40. And when we got to 5:40, we were still ahead. But the East Germans came through quite fast because our speed declined very rapidly in the last 250. And we crossed the line, I can't remember what, but half a length or 3/4 of a length down. Chris has written a book about this called Pieces of 8. And I have to confess that I never read the last chapter because I knew how it ended. And I didn't really want to. So we were bitterly disappointed, bitterly disappointed. And I had a conversation with Bob Janousek very shortly after that. And I said, Bob, was it the drugs what done it? And he said, absolutely not. Their system was so much more thorough. The drugs was a part, yes, it enabled lesser athletes to do more training. And so it increased and improved the ability of the weaker members of their squad to compete at the highest level. Bob doesn't think it made a great deal of difference to the best athletes. They were going to be that good anyway. They were freaks anyway. I mean, most of us are freaks. We're 6'6". We've got lungs 7 liters. We're different from other folk. So the differences were in the training regime, were in the equipment, and the fact, and this is crucial, they trained extensively. That means they went for, as people do nowadays, for hours a day, 3 or 4 hours a day, below their anaerobic threshold, plodding along, actually rowing really rather badly, in my opinion. We frequently saw them flopping around from side to side and looking very careless indeed. But they did masses and masses of miles at a low cadence and low pressure. And then when race season came on, they piled it on very quickly. And that endurance training meant that they could keep going through the 2,000 meters at an even pace for each 500. East Germany did a roughly even last 500 with their middle two, and we slowed right down because we trained anaerobically for an hour and a half every night, and we were knackered every day. We had lactic in our knees and elbows and right through our bodies from within 20 minutes of starting because we were sprinting all the time. We rode at 40, they rode at 36. We were never, ever able to lift our heads off the bottom of the boat because we were always training under pressure because we were all in work. So we would get down to training at 6 o'clock, the earliest anybody could get away from work, and get down to Putney. We would train for an hour and a half, and that's all Janousek could do. We trained a maximum of, we trained 10 sessions a week instead of 13, or more. We were sprinters, and it was a headwind. And the race went, instead of being over in 5:40 or 5:37 or something we might have aimed at, it was over in 6:03, and we'd lost it in that last bit. It wasn't the drugs what done it. It was their entire system and the cradle to grave welfare that they lived under. Whereas we were cycling down to training. And Janousek said, "How can you cycle back after the training?" I said, "I haven't got a choice. I haven't got a car. So I've got to cycle. And it's 4 miles to where I live, through London, breathing out. That was the conditions we were in. The East Germans would never have allowed that. But equally, I had a very weak lower lumbar region of my back. I've got an extra vertebrae. It was deformed. And I had a bad back all that time. And Janousek said to me, "If you were an East German, you would have been dropped on day one. They wouldn't have wasted time with you." So there was an upside for us.
Yeah, very, very interesting indeed. And in that sort of post-rationalization, would the World Drug WADA drug testing organization have picked up that drug taking today?
Interestingly, they went to a lab, all the East German athletes, I mean, not rowers, just everybody, all their track athletes, everybody who was on the programs. And it wasn't just oral turinabol. I simplified that. There were clomiphene and various others. But essentially, they were being dosed up with artificial testosterone. And they were all tested at a place called Croatia, which is on the where Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany meet. Croatia is a town there, and there's a lab there where they were all tested. So each athlete would be dosed until a certain time, and then they would see how long it took that athlete's body to clear all the evidence of the oral turinabol out. Now, later on, there were various ways of blocking that, but in the early days, they were simply tested and they were taken off the dope the right time before they went abroad. And they were tested only when they went abroad to train. So no East German rower ever failed the dope test. So we have no grounds for complaint that they were taking performance-enhanced drugs or anything like that. It was just the training enhancement that they were using. Training support, they called it. Croatia now, funnily enough, is one of the WADA-approved labs. But the difference now is the out-of-season testing, and it is out of competition season. And the fact that athletes nowadays have to have a whereabout, they've got a whereabouts clause in their contract, and they have to be findable within 24 hours, and they can't cheat on that sort of thing. And not being findable is enough to get you to get a mark against your name. So what applied then and what applies now are utterly different. But I think the thing that we probably should be grateful for, and which is in the recent biography of Tommy Keller that some of you will have read and I read just the other day, is the efforts that were made to bring out-of-season testing into rowing almost before any other sport. So that was remarkable in the foresight that Peter Coney, who was the British treasurer of FISA at the time, and Tommy Keller, who was the president of FISA at the time, began to introduce. They weren't terribly effective, but they started and they tried and they led the way.
That's very interesting observation from both sides of the coin. Bearing in mind that there were quite a lot of people who interviewed Jurgen Grobler and recruited him to come and work in the UK, why do you think they never asked him about his part in that East German doping regime, Hugh?
Well, I actually think Chris should answer this question on the basis that he is a member of the Leander Club, and it was the Leander Club that hired Jurgen in the first instance as a private club, hiring a private coach. But Chris has done some asking around on this point. Chris
sadly has dropped out of the broadcast, and
you're going to my signal is still going. Good, right. Well, the answer is that Leander was looking for a coach. They had fallen out with various people. British Rowing, or Amateur Rowing Association as it then was, had fallen out with various people. Mike Spracklen, others were taking jobs all over the world, and British Rowing hadn't got any coaches. Ian Wilson, who is a Nottinghamshire figure and was then the Concept 2 agent for Europe, and that meant he was not only providing ergometers to all the clubs and other places, national training centres, but he was also providing blades. The East Germans had their own ergometers, but they didn't have their own blades, because once the cleaver blade came in, they needed. So Ian was dealing with East Germans, Klaus Filter in particular. He saw Jurgen on various visits to Berlin and also on various visits to the Crash Bees and various other ergometer events where the Germans would come, possibly just to collect information, but also to collect blades and so on. So there was always stuff going on. And Leander said something to Ian Wilson, do you think there's anybody coming out of East Germany who might be help to us? And Ian said, yes, there is. And the one that Klaus Filter recommends is Jurgen Grobler. And I think Klaus, who I've also interviewed at length for the book, probably thought that Jurgen was an outstanding coach, which we now have good evidence for, but secondly, thought that he was probably the one who would adapt best. So I think he was selected by Klaus as the person most likely to function properly in the West as well as in the East. So Ian suggested to Leander, and Leander said, what a good idea. We need it for our club members, Pinsent and Redgrave. This is there was state support, a great deal more than we had in my day, but nevertheless, it was quite small. And Matt and Steve both had to go out and seek private sponsorship, which as gold medalists, they were better able to do. But prior to post-96, before the sports lottery was announced, Steve said he was giving up because there wasn't any money left. It was that bad. So Leander hired him as a club coach, and there is either a conspiracy theory that they deliberately didn't ask him because they didn't want to know the answer, or you subscribe to the cock-up theory of history. My personal preference is that the cock-up theory of history. I think they just didn't think to ask. How lacking in curiosity that suggests the people doing it were boggles me. I mean, it's astonishing, because there were lots of people from my generation and the generations following it. The Minister of Sport, Colin Moynihan, had coxed a crew which came second in the Moscow Olympics to an East German 8. So Moynihan, the Minister of Sport, had exactly the same grudge as you asked me about earlier. And actually, because I talked to Colin quite a lot, I know that he had that grudge rather further in the forefront. He hadn't had Janousek wind him down from it. So, there were plenty of people in the hierarchy of sport who couldn't imagine that Leander wouldn't ask this question. But they didn't. So then, curiously, when the ARA got its act together, at least to get a salary and to say, can we hire him as chief coach Great Britain? And he was transferred out of Leander and into the Amateur Rowing Association. Well, of course, they didn't need to ask any searching due diligence questions, did they? Because Leander is a very respectable club. It's the most respectable rowing club in Britain. So, of course, he's all right. So, amazingly, nobody asked at that point, even though, as I've just said, the Minister of Sport and various other people had a grudge. Later, when people asked questions in Parliament saying, can we be sure that this East German coach is clean? The Minister for Sport would say, I will have to ask my officials to inquire. His officials would then go to the Amateur Rowing Association and say, is there any question that Jurgen Grobler was involved in the East German sports doping program? And the officials would be told, no, we have no evidence that he was involved in that. And as a result, the officials went back and told the minister there is no evidence that he was involved. Utter
So they didn't.
lack of curiosity.
Yeah, so they didn't have the evidence because they didn't ask the question, not that it wasn't there for the finding.
I really want to absolve Jurgen from any taint in this process. He did what he did in East Germany because that's what you did in East Germany. The book is very clear and argues all the way through that there was little choice. Now, he was a willing volunteer. He was outstandingly good at it. He could have stayed at junior club level and earned a living and carried on, but he chose to push himself by brilliant selections and trainings into the forefront of the East German system. And that meant embracing all aspects of their system, including the blue pills. I think that he has handled himself in the West as well as anybody possibly could. So there are denials on the record from him when asked the question direct by journalists. But I think that he has done his level best not to betray either the athletes who admire him enormously or the employers who hired him to do a job. And there's a huge furore. Leander Club is having a hissy fit about this book. The stewards at Henley were all rather upset about it. It's caused a good deal of ruckus because it's having a go at Jurgen. Actually, they hadn't read it when they were getting uptight about it. It isn't having a go at Jurgen. It is an extraordinary, in my opinion, career which we've written about down to the last detail of success because of his virtues. And I don't think that it's right that he should be discombobulated in any way by the fact that he absolutely was part of a doping regime which ceased 25 or 27 years ago altogether, and in which he began his career. I think that others deserve a good slapping, but I don't think he deserves any criticism at all.
What trade-offs do you think Jurgen is willing to make? This is a question from Helene Koku, who's live with us on Facebook. Yep. He asks, why are others less successful? Is he willing to not do things or not be bothered by other things which others do care about?
No, I think he takes no shortcuts at all. I think he has devised a system which is more likely than any other system to produce winners, given that he's starting where he is. That is to say, Britain is in Europe, so we go to high altitude, they go to high altitude in Austria at Sobreda. It's a camp which he set up with the East Germans. He knew it intimately before he took any British athletes there. In fact, he had the key to the shed where all the boys and the coaching launches and all the kit was stored. So, he just unlocked the shed and took out the East German stuff, painted Union flags all over it, and carried on. And he applies that system, which he understands better than anybody, ruthlessly well. And an illustration of it, it's very simple, it's in the book. Matt Langridge was rowing 7 in the 8 in 2016, which had lost to the Germans several times during the season of 2016. Jurgen's 4 was winning, and that was his best bet for a gold medal in Rio, but he wanted the 8 because he'd never won the 8s. He has an extraordinary record, but the 8 was not part of it, so he wanted an 8. And they lost in Poznan, the last World Cup, their last chance to try out their race speed. Again, they lost to Germany by half a length-ish, I can't remember. They came off the water and sat for the standard press conference in the shade under the stand at Poznan. And I went to the press conference, and at the end of a row of people sitting on their chairs was Matt Langridge, the 7th man. And somebody was asking a question to the crowd as a whole. So I sat next to Matt and I said, "You lost by half a length. What's going to happen in Rio?" And he said, "We will win." And Matt is not a poet or a fantasist or he has a very grounded vision of what he can do and what is possible. So I said, how do you know you will win? He said, we have 6 weeks. Jurgen is the past master at taking a crew from here through 6 weeks and improving it to the point that we will win. In due course, as you will remember, in Rio, they won by about half a length. So they improved a length in that 6 weeks. It wasn't that Jurgen did it. It wasn't a fluke. It was that Matt knew he would do it. And the whole squad knew that he would do it. So when Alex Gregory said towards the end of the book, after that training, you know you will not stop in an Olympic final. From a guy who got 2 gold medals. I mean, this guy never stopped in anything. I mean, the most wonderful mover, fantastically competitive athlete, but he had been trained in the Jurgen system from the beginning, and he still needed to cover that doubt that, you know, will you be steady under fire is what troops think about. Will you stop in an Olympic final is what rowers think about. And they know they won't. They've been through so much. And so I think it comes back to where I started. Bruce Granger saying it's the application of very simple principles ruthlessly applied.
You make some observations in the book about how rowers get into the British international squad via juniors, under 23s and so on. What do you think are the flaws in the current system, Hugh?
I'm not the one to answer that, but I did have a conversation with Paul Thompson, who's UK Great Britain chief coach women, and has people like Catherine Granger and, you know, doubles and all sorts of medals. One, a wonderful pair of Glover and Stanning, came out of his stable. And Paul's view is that a well-organized country would have exactly the cycle that you stated. You would have clubs, not schools, and clubs and other ways of starting. You would have just clubs training people who would then be drawn up into junior rowing, up into under 23 rowing, and that there would be a funnel leading people from the bottom of the sport, from novice to international podiums. And that funnel is not present in Britain because people disappear off to university. So our top rowing schools, whether they're women's schools like LEH or men's schools like Eton and St Paul's and Hampton, are also the school, the top rowing schools are also tend to be the schools that get people into Oxbridge particularly well. So they go rushing off to Oxford and Cambridge and they train there, or they go rushing off to Durham or to Newcastle, or to, you know, there are lots of alternatives where they can go, but they drop out of the system because they go and row for their university. And it drives Paul Thompson nuts because we don't have a straight through funnel. And if you turned up at Oxford and said, I'm a student at Oxford, but I don't want to row in the boat race, I want to go and train with the national squad at Leander, nobody would say boo, but then none of them do. Now, when we get into the future and maybe there's a sponsorless boat race and we haven't got the money in the system at both Oxford and Cambridge, at Durham, at Newcastle and the other universities, London, its various colleges and the university as a whole, once Imperial, particularly strong boathouse, once the money drops out there, then maybe people will be drawn into the national squad. But British rowing is facing a financial crisis right across the board, nothing to do with Brexit, although that won't make it any better. And that is that this boat race is sponsorless after this year, next year rather, 2019. It may get a sponsor, but it may not. And the lottery money is reducing rapidly, the amount being taken by the lottery, and the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Sports Lottery Fund, which are the two principal uses of lottery money, are both cutting back drastically. So it may be that we end up, by the accident of having very little money, that we actually rationalize our system and end up with something a bit more like Paul Thompson would wish it to be.
So the world-class start system, which British rowing runs, which is designed to keep these young athletes in the British rowing system in a parallel environment to that club and university system which you described is likely to be one of the casualties?
I don't know. No, that has been really good. I mean, Mo Spee and one or two other people came through that program, and they are the greats of our present rowing system. But it is the crews are drawn from several sources. That's Thompson's point, that they're not drawn from a single source where you've identified a generation coming up. They are drawn from several sources, and it's the fitting them together that is difficult when you haven't got very much time. And the other thing is that certainly Thompson and Grobler's training systems are so hard that people who have other career ambitions than just going on winning gold medals year after year are inclined to follow the George Nash, Constantine Louloudis, those people. They did well as juniors. They came into the system, they got bronze medals at their first Olympics, they got a gold medal at their second Olympics, and they're out of the system at 24 or 25. I don't know how old they are, but that sort of age, they're gone. And that a lot left the system post-Rio, an awful lot. There are 3 people in the squad at the moment who were gold medalists in Rio out of a total of 12 rowers. The only rowers who got gold medals in Rio who weren't Brits were, guess who? Fellow medalists Bond and Murray.
Yeah, and they're both out of the system too, but they're a lot older, and one of them is continuing a sporting career in another sport.
On a bicycle.
On a bicycle. Another sitting down sport. It's an interesting conundrum. Hugh, it's been a delight. Thank you, and Chris. Just tell the listeners a little bit more about how they can connect with you and buy the book.
You can connect with us most easily. I mean, the book is available retail in bookshops, and the more people who do that, the better it is for bookshops. But the truth is, most people now buy on Amazon, and there's also a site called The Book People where it is even cheaper. We're selling quite a lot, so it's gone into a second print already. But it is a book which I think has something. We've talked a lot about Grobler and his career. We haven't talked as much for the non-rower about the description of a life of an extraordinary servant of his country in East Germany, and then an extraordinary servant of his country in Great Britain. And I see Jurgen as a civil servant of unutterable integrity and enormous success. And he's been awarded in East Germany with all sorts of different medals. He had a photograph for many years in his hall of him shaking hands with Honecker, the president, when he was, or the secretary of the party, when he was being given one of his honors there, and he was made an OBE in Britain, which is something that brought him to tears. And he's not emotional in that sort of way very much. He doesn't cry when his crews win gold medals, but he cries when he gets an OBE. He's a pretty amazing civil servant, and I think that that's a story in itself, quite apart from the sporting aspect of it. So you can get us on Amazon, you can get us on hive.co.uk. There are various book sites, and I certainly hope on your website too.
Fantastic. Hugh, thank you so much for your time. And again, to the listeners, RowingChat wants to know about you. Can you help us by taking a short survey? The website link is bit.ly, bit.ly/RowingChat survey. The more we know, the better we can make RowingChat. Until next time, goodbye.